Have you ever sensed in a moment encountering the created order that you felt God's work? And if in all these moments, God sees the Spirit played out in plants, in insects, in mammals, reptiles, in waves and water, in earth, how is it that God chooses to enter the world, to redeem the world, to fulfill the promise of creation? Not in so many of the forms in which God could enter the world, but chooses rather to enter as one of us. So again, I just invite you to take a moment and reflect upon what you've seen, what you've thought, what you felt. And reflect upon the coming of God into the world.
In this moment of pause, we note that God sees all of God's creation, created good in God's image, good in God's sight. And we recall God's gracious acts of creation, that God creates all people in God's image. For God speaks at the moment of creation, "Let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness." And so, God created humanity in their image. God lovingly looks down in the world and sees humanity created in God's image. God sees the complexities, the diversities, all that God has created. Looking across the globe at this moment, God sees some are awake and some are asleep. Some toil while others rest. Some have more than enough, while others struggle greatly just to get by. The world God sees is made up of God's human creatures, diverse on every continent. Europe, Asia, North and South America, Africa, Australia, and even in our time, Antarctica. Speaking thousands upon thousands of languages, celebrating the creativities of culture, of every color, white, black, indigenous, Asian, Latino, peoples of mixed origins, people who are at peace, people who are at war, people who weep, people who mourn. God sees all as reflections of God's first humans, of Adam and Eve, and in so the beauty of all. And yet, the brokenness in each. God sees all the desire to love as God does, to be united with God, and the clinging to that at the same time, which does not satisfy. God sees people choosing what they know rather than what gives life. Tribalism, ethnocentricity, racism, comfort in one's own, patriarchy, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, because sometimes it is too hard for God's people to consider others. And God sees wars against the powerful nations trying to dominate and to take more land. God recalls the desire for all people to exist in harmony, to praise, reverence, and serve God and one another, being in relationship with God in a spirit of generosity, of service. God recalls the original desires for those first humans, that they may be fruitful and multiply, filling the earth and subduing it, having dominion over the fishes of the seas, the birds of the air, and all creatures. And God recalls it was very good, and still is. And yet, God sees what is lost, what happens soon after. The misrecalling what God had hoped for. Reinterpreting dominion to domination. Filling the earth to capitalize on its every corner. From subduing to controlling. Forgetting that all humans were from the same creative energy of God that created all creatures on the earth. God sees the earth bruised and battered. God sees all the devastation in the world, the declining salmon swimming upstream, ducks and otters stained with oil because another ship has crashed, pouring millions of gallons into the water. God sees and hears the groaning of the earth, of God's people. And God decides always to respond. God sees and hears the groanings of people in every time, in every place. The Hebrew people, God recalls, trying to find their own promised land, a land of milk and honey, a land promised to be free of slavery. God reveals God's self to Moses and decides to enter into their lot, to cast God's lot with them, to lead God's people across the waters and through the desert to the promised land. And yet, again, God recalls the degradation, the separation, the divisions into separate peoples and destructive lands. God sees that it is the temptation of humans. And so God sends prophets to tell people to return to God, to care for the earth and all of its inhabitants. To remember the widow, orphan, stranger, the most marginalized, for they themselves were once strangers. God calls, hoping they will listen. And God does not forget, because God promises a new heart will be planted, a new covenant with God, dwelling so intimately within, not on stone, but in hearts. And so God sees the beauties of the earth, the glories of the sky, the beauties of each hour, of the day and of the night. Hill and vale, and tree and flower, sun and moon and stars of light. God sees what God has created and remembers it is good, though bruised and broken. God sees the joys of human love, brother, sister, parent, child, and God smiles, recalling how good each person is. And yet again, God sees the divisions, the hatred, the racism, effects on marginalized groups, and the intense pains of the earth. God hears the moanings, and so too God moans and groans. So too God moans and God groans. I want you to take another moment to pause, to sit with, to recall the beauties of the earth and the groanings of the earth, the beauties of the people around the world and the sufferings of those due to powerful marginalizing others. How does God hear, groan, and moan with all people and all the earth?
Promise of creation. Poured out in the human family, the diversity, the joys and sorrows, the ability we are given to share with God, even the creative act, even the act of marking the earth filled with God. becomes one with us, and God becomes one with us, and chooses to bring about the fulfillment of the promise, not from without, not by an act of power, but instead, in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a town of Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man named Joseph of the house of David. And the virgin's name was Mary. And coming to her, he said, "Hail, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was greatly troubled at what was said and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. Then the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid. Mary, you have found favor with God. Behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of David his father, and he will rule over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." But Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I have no relations with a man?" And the angel said to her in reply, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And behold, Elizabeth, your relative, has also conceived a son in her old age. And this is the 6th month for her who was called barren. For nothing will be impossible for God." And Mary said, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. May it be done to me according to your word."
We know this story well. We know the story of Mary, the story of the Incarnation. Our spirituality, Ignatian spirituality here at the Parish, invites us to see the story another way, from the perspective of God, before the angel comes to Mary. And so I invite you again to consider what God sees looking down on the earth. Seeing all that is the second person of the Trinity, the one to become Jesus, will say, seeing all this, we can tell them the glories of us. We can tell them and show them how to make all oppression cease. We can do this that they might listen. What if we try something new? What if we become that which is very good? A human, ourselves. Sure, says God the Father, the first person, we can do that, but will they listen? Will someone say yes to our plea? And so yes is the answer. God knows that in all time, in all space, it is time again to bring the message to the world in a new way. People might hear what is truly good about all. God pays attention. God knows that oppression will cease. God sees the suffering in the Roman Empire occupation, and so God looks to that beautiful young woman doing her best, engaged to be a respectable carpenter, willing to make her his wife, to care for and honor her. And as we know, God decides to approach her. That poor young woman in a faraway village, off the beaten path, a place that later one might ask, can anything good come from there? A place not considered important, away from the powerful. God comes. God sends God's messenger, and God looks into the heart and mind. And with God's servant asks, would you, Mary, be willing to bear the Messiah, to be his mother? Would you be willing to raise him knowing that you are unwed? You will and may be scorned. You may lose your husband. You may risk your safety because the world does not care about unwed women who are pregnant. It is a risk. It is your freedom. God looks intently, looking down at the world and waits. Does she hesitate as she declares, "How can this be? For I have had no relations with a man." There is a pause. "It is of God," the angel says. "God will do it." Another pause. "Be it done according to your will." A total yes. In her courage, in all her yes, she proclaims the yes of God, that all truly was good from the beginning. So good that God enters. So good that all of creation deserves and sees to see and experience God. So good that despite the divisions, the brokenness, the wounded earth, the racism, sexism, violence, oppression, there is more. That more is God. The God of tender compassion, the God of mercy who decides once again this Advent to pitch God's tent among us because our very essence, our DNA, our bodies, the elements we share with all of creation, it is all very good. The plants, the animals, the fishes, the birds, they are good. The seasons, the days, the nights, the moon and stars, hills and valley, they are all good. And through Mary's yes, God offers thanks. Through Mary's yes, Jesus will come to proclaim that in this our Christmas season, all oppression may cease, and we may become not just one human family as God intended, but one united creation. For as the prophet tells us, justice shall be the band around his waist, and faithfulness a belt upon his hips. Then the wolf shall be the guest of the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat. The calf and the young lion shall browse together with the little child to guide them. The cow and the bear shall graze. Together their young shall lie down. The lion shall eat hay like the ox. The baby play by the viper's den. And the child lay his hand on the adder's lair. They shall not harm or destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth shall be filled with knowledge of the Lord, as water covers the sea.
Sense of God's creation and God's incarnation are bound up together. God comes not with a lesson, but with a presence to abide with us and to be one with us in the world in which we share, in which we inhabit. And so what we're going to do now is take a few minutes, and we're going to ask you to take just a couple of minutes of personal reflection, and then we're going to open some rooms. And if you have something that's moved you, that you've been thinking of as you've been listening and reflecting, that we invite you to do a little faith sharing in small groups. And then we will come back at so we're going to go in small groups in just a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back about 1:35 and have some time for larger group connection. If you have questions or you have something that you'd like to say that you heard, that you feel moved to speak, So it'll be a little bit of a Quaker meeting. I would ask as you go into the small groups to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak and that we share that time together. So I'm going to just mute myself and let everyone think for a few minutes, and then you'll be invited into some breakout rooms. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. You can take another minute if you would like.